Okay, story. All right, this excerpt's taken from Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia. A short story is a work of fiction that is usually written in prose, often in narrative form. This format tends to be more pointed than longer works of fiction such as novellas in the 20th and 21st century sense. And novels. Short story definitions based on length differ somewhat even among professional writers, in part because of the fragmentation of medium into genres. Since the short story format includes a wide range of genres and styles, the actual length is determined by the individual author's preference or the story's actual needs in terms of creative trajectory or story arc, and the submission guidelines relevant to the story's actual market. Guidelines vary greatly among publishers. Okay, so what that's saying is that there's really no set length for a short story. If you're a writer and you're writing a short story, it can actually go longer than short. It's up to the individual writer of the length of it. Many short story writers define their work through a combination of creative, personal expression, and artistic integrity. They attempt to resist categorization by genre as well as definition by numbers, finding such approaches limiting and counterintuitive to artistic form and reasoning. As a result, definitions of the short story based on length splinter even more when the writing process is taken into consideration. Overview. Authors such as Charles Dickens, Kurt Vonnegut, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Virginia Woolf, Boslav Lovecraft, D.H. Lawrence, Thomas Mann, and Ernest Hemingway were highly accomplished writers of both short story and novels. Short stories have their roots in oral storytelling, traditions, and the prose anecdote, a swiftly sketched situation that quickly comes to the point. With the rise of the comparative realistic novel, the short story evolved as a miniature version with some of its first perfectly independent examples in the tales of E.T.A. Hoffmann. Other 19th century writers well known for their short stories include Nikolai Gogol, Guy de Maupassant, and Boileau Proust. Some authors are known almost entirely for their short stories, either by choice, because they wrote nothing else, or by critical regard. Short story writing is thought of as a challenging art. An example is Borges, who won an American fame with The Garden of Forking Paths, published in August of 48, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine. Another example is O. Henry, author of Gift of the Magi, for whom O. Henry Award is named. American examples include Flannery O'Connor, John Cheever, and Raymond Carver. Short stories have been adopted for half-hour and hour radio dramas, as on NBC Presents Short Story, from 1951 to 52. The art of storytelling is doubtlessly older than record of civilization. Even the so-called modern short story, which was the last of the major literary types to evolve, has an ancient lineage. Perhaps the oldest and most direct ancestor of the short story is the anecdote and illustrative point, straight to the point. The ancient parable and fable, starkly brief narrative, used to enforce some moral or spiritual truth, anticipate the severe brevity and unity of some short stories written today. Short stories tend to be less complex than novels. Usually a short story focuses on one incident, has a single plot, a single setting, and a small number of characters, and covers a small period of time. In longer forms of fiction, stories tend to contain certain core elements of dramatic structure: exposition, the introduction of setting, situation, main characters; complication, the event that introduces the conflict; rising action; crisis, the decisive moment for the protagonist and his commitment to a course of action; the climax, the point of the highest interest in terms of the conflict and the point with the most action; resolution, the point when the conflict is resolved; and morale. Because of their length, short stories may or may not follow this pattern. Some do not follow patterns at all. For example, modern short stories only occasionally have an exposition. More typical, though, is the abrupt beginning, with the story starting in the middle of the action. As with longer stories, plots of short stories also have a climax, crisis, or turning point. However, the endings of many short stories are abrupt and open and may or may not have a moral or practical lesson. As with any art forms, the exact characteristic of a short story will vary by creator. When short stories intend to convey a specific ethical or moral perspective, they fall into a more specific subcategory called parables or fables. This specific kind of short story has been used by spiritual and religious leaders worldwide to inspire, enlighten, and educate their followers. Determining what exactly separates a short story from a longer fiction is problematic. A classic definition of a short story is that one should be able to read it in one setting. A point most notably made by Edgar Allan Poe's essay, The Philosophy of Composition, in 1846. Interesting to note that the idea of one setting may no longer mean the same time period. In modern, faster-paced times, older definitions place the maximum word count of a short story at anywhere from 1,000 to 9,000 words. In contemporary usage, the term short story most often refers to a work of fiction no longer than 20,000 words and no shorter than 1,000 words. Stories of less than 1,000 words are sometimes referred to as short stories or flash fiction. As a point of reference for the science fiction genre writer, the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America define short story length Nebula Awards for science fiction submission guidelines as having a word count of less than 7,500 words. The history behind the short story. Short stories date back to oral storytelling traditions which originally produced epics such as the Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Oral narratives were often told in the form of rhyming or rhythmic verse, often including recurring sections or, the case of Homer, Homeric epitaphs. Such stylistic devices often acted as mnemonics for easier recall, rendition, and adaptation of the story. Short sections of verse might focus on individual narratives that could be told at one sitting. The overall arc of the tale would emerge only through telling of multiple such sections. Fables, succinct tales with an explicit moral, were said by the Greek historian Herodotus to have been invented in the 6th century BCE by a Greek slave named Aesop. Though other times the nationalities have also been given for him, these ancient fables are today known as Aesop's fables. The other ancient form of a short story is the anecdote. Was popular under the Roman Empire. Anecdotes functioned as a part of a parable, a brief, realistic narrative that embodies a point. Many surviving Roman anecdotes were collected in the 13th or 14th century as the Gesta Romanarium. Anecdotes remained popular in Europe well into the 18th century when the fictional anecdote letters of Sir Rogers de Coverley were published. In Europe, the storytelling tradition began to develop into written stories in early 14th century, most notably with Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and Giovanni Boccaccia's Decameron. Both of these books are composed of individual short stories which range from farce or humorous anecdotes to well-crafted literary fiction, set with a larger narrative story, a frame story. Although the frame tale device was not adopted by all writers, at the end of the 16th century, some of the most popular short stories in Europe were the darkly tragic novella of Matteo Bandello. The mid-17th century in France saw the development of a refined short novel, the Nouvelle, by such authors as Lafayette. In the 1690s, traditional fairy tales began to be published. One of the most famous collections was by Perrault, the appearance of Antoine Gillian's first modern translation of The Thousand and One Nights, or The Arabian Nights, from 1704. Another translation appeared in 1710 to 1712 would have an enormous influence on the 18th century European short stories of Voltaire and Diderot and others. 1790 through 1850, there are early examples of short stories published separately between 1790 and 1810, but the first true collections of short stories appeared between 1810 and 1830 in several countries around the same period. The first short stories in the United Kingdom were Gothic tales like Richard Cumberland's remarkable narrative, The Prisoner of Montrose. Great novelists like Sir Walter Scott and Charles Dickens also wrote some short stories. One of the earliest short stories in the United States was Charles Brockens Brown's Somnambulism from 1805. Washington Irving wrote mysterious tales including Rip Van Winkle, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Hawthorne published the first part of his Twice Told Tales. Edgar Allan Poe wrote his tales of mystery and imagination between 1842 and 1859. Classic stories are the Fall of the House of Usher, The Telltale Heart, The Cask of Amontillado, The Pit and the Pendulum, and the first detective story, The Murders in Rue Morgue. In The Philosophy of Composition, Poe argued that a literary work should be short enough for a reader to finish in one sitting. In Germany, the first collection of short stories was by von Kleist in 1810 and 11. The Brothers Grimm published their first volume of collected fairy tales in 1812. Hoffmann followed with his own original fantasy tales, of which The Nutcracker and the Mouse King is the most famous. France, Merimée wrote Matteo Falcone in 1829. In Russia, Alexander Pushkin wrote romantic and mysterious tales including The Blizzard, The Queen of Spades, Nevsky Prospect, The Nose, The Overcoat are dark humorous tales about human misery. In 1850 to 1900, moving through, we're almost to us. The latter 19th century, the growth of print magazines and journals created a strong demand for short fiction of between 3,000 and 15,000 words. All right. In the United Kingdom, Thomas Hardy wrote dozens of short stories, including The Three Strangers, A Mirror Interlude, and Barbara of the House of Grabe. Rudyard Kipling published short story collections for grown-ups, Plain Tales from the Hills, as well as for children, The Jungle Book. Arthur Conan Doyle brought the detective story to a new height with The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. H.G. Wells wrote his first science fiction stories in the 1880s, one of the best known as The Country of the Blind. In the United States, Melville published a story, The Piazza Tales. The celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County was the title story of Mark Twain's first book. 1 year later, in 1884, Brainerd Matthews, the first American professor of dramatic literature, published The Philosophy of the Short Story. At that same year, Matthews was the first one to name the emerging genre short story. Another theorist of narrative fiction was Henry James. James wrote a lot of short stories himself, including The Real Thing, The Beast in the Jungle. Kate Joplin published stories in several magazines. The most prolific French author of short stories was Maupassant. Stories like Ball of Fat and The Useless Beauty are good examples of French realism. In Russian, Turgenev gained recognition with his story collection of sportsman sketches. Late in life, Dostoevsky wrote The Meek One, The Dream of the Ridiculous Man, the stories Great Logical and Philosophical Death. All right, moving into the 1900s in the United Kingdom, the Strand Magazine, The Sketch, Harper's Magazine, and Storyteller contributed to the popularity of the short story. Hector Hugo Monroe, also known by his pen name of Sakai, wrote satirical short stories about Edwardian England. Maugham, who wrote over 100 short stories, was one of the most popular authors of his time. P.G. Wodehouse published his first collection of comic stories about Butler Jeeves in 1917. Lots of detective stories were written by Agatha Christie and Dorothy L. Sayers. The short stories by Virginia Woolf and Kew Gardens and Solid Objects about a politician with mental problems. In Ireland, James Joyce published his collection, Dubliners. All right. Moving on, after 1900 to 1945, this was during World War I and World War II. So after 1945, which is post World War II, all right, the period following World War II saw a great flowering of literary short fiction in the United States. The New Yorker continues to publish works of the form's leading mid-century practitioners, including Shirley Jackson, whose story, The Lottery, published in 1948, elicited the strongest response in the magazine's history to that time. Other frequent contributors during the 40s included John Cheever, John Steinbeck, Gene Stafford, and Eudora Welty. J.D. Salinger's 9 stories experiment with the point of view and voice, while Flannery O'Connor's A Good Man Is Hard to Find reinvigorated the Southern Gothic style. Cultural and social identity played a considerable role in much of the short fiction of the 60s. Roth and Paley cultivated distinctive Jewish American voices. Tilly Olsen's Stand Here Ironing adopted a consciously feminist perspective. Baldwin's collection Going to Meet the Man told stories of African American life. Frank O'Connor's The Lonely Voice, an exploration of the short story, appeared in 1963. Wallace Stigner's short stories are primarily set in American West. Stephen King published a lot of short stories in men's magazines in the 60s and after. The 70s saw the rise of the postmodern short story in the works of Donald Bartholomew and John Barth. Traditionalists include John Updike and Joyce Carol Oates maintained significant influence on the form. Minimalism gained widespread influence in the 1980s, most notably in the work of Raymond Carver and Ann Beatty. Alright, so I don't know how many of those names you recognize. I recognize a bunch of them, but the one you should recognize is Stephen King. All right, Stephen King novels, wrote all the horror books that have become movies like The Stand and Christine and Pet Cemetery and just about any of the older scary movies. The Shining were all written by Stephen King. All right, so what we're going to start now, we got about 10 minutes, so we're going to keep going, but our section this week is going to be over the short story, and hopefully you're going to get your juices flowing and you guys can come up with a good short story.